Hi, and welcome back to the WHVP podcast. In this episode of the podcast, Managing Partner Jamie Vrijhof-Droese sits down with Alisa Burkhard, attorney at law of Flyingllawyers, to discuss migration to Switzerland. They will begin by discussing Alisa's background in migrating to Switzerland and her choice to study law and practice law in Switzerland, and then talk about opportunities for Americans wishing to immigrate to Switzerland. They will then talk about the cultural differences between Switzerland and the US. Now, let's get into it.
Hello and welcome, Alisa. It is a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks so much, Jamie. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with just giving our listeners and viewers a little bit of an overview over who you are. We met last year, and I've been fascinated by your story and background ever since, because you're a very international person. You have a variety of cultures and countries in your DNA. So I'd be very interested to hearing more about that, and I think that will be quite interesting for our listeners as well.
Yeah, sure. So I do have quite an international background, which led me to where I am today, and some of the things that I do, which have a connection to the things we'll be discussing in the podcast today. So I was born in Russia, and my family emigrated to the US when I was a small child. So I grew up in the US, went to NYU, got a degree there. Fast forwarding a lot of years, obviously, in the story, and then emigrated a second time to Switzerland for love at the time. Like many people do here from the US, which is a topic I guess we'll come to. And I decided to become a lawyer in Switzerland because that's also important for maybe for listeners to know. It can be a little bit difficult to get through in Switzerland without a real, paper qualifications and a real, something that the Swiss can understand what we Americans can do. So I decided to go to law school. And law school here is pretty much free, unlike in the US. So I'm very grateful, actually, that I was able to have this opportunity here. And I became a Swiss qualified attorney, passed the bar exam, all in German, and started practicing as an attorney at law about 6 years ago. And since then, I've worked at various law firms, and I just actually started my own business less than a year ago. We started our own firm in Zurich, and it's been a heck of a ride so far.
Yeah, so from what I've seen, I can confirm that you've been very busy. I definitely want to get into more detail with your company and what you've been up to in the past year. But maybe before we do that, you can tell us a bit more about what the motivation was for you to study law here, because I think at NYU you studied something different. Was it just because it was almost free here, or were there other considerations as well?
That's a really good question. When I think back on why I studied law and how it actually all happened, I actually can't believe that I ever did it. It was actually quite a crazy idea, and I'm lucky it turned out the way it did. Also, thanks to some hard work, I have to admit. But at NYU, I studied political science, and I have a Master of Arts in political science. When I got to Switzerland, I realized that a US degree, even a master's in political science, isn't really something that's easy to find a job with. So I started looking at websites of Swiss universities, looking at majors to see what I could study in addition or again. And really the only thing that interested me was law. I really can't explain it. That's the only thing that appealed, and maybe the challenge as well. So I decided to go study law in German, even though my German was not fluent at the time. And I just put a lot of hours into it and a lot of intellectual capacity and energy, and it turned out really well in the end.
Oh, that's amazing. And I'm really glad to hear that. So tell us about how it turned out in the end. Tell us about Flyingllawyers. I think just the name of the company that you joined or co-founded is already quite insightful and interesting.
I think that Flyingllawyers is the culmination of everything in my character and my career path that actually led me to, to start that business. It's a fully female-owned firm. So we're 3 female partners, attorneys, Swiss qualified attorneys, and 1 female external counsel. And our kind of mission is basically to transform the way that legal services are provided. So going away from this fixed model of high hourly rates. You don't know what you're going to get. Someone's just kind of there for small projects, but then going away. We try to be more integrated into our clients' businesses and really to follow them along the entire life path of a business. So that can be corporate law, from basically the incorporation of a company until, in certain cases, unfortunately, it's liquidation or certain M&A transactions. And for private clients, so for individuals, we offer services in relation to especially immigration law and work permits, but also all kinds of private and professional ventures that they choose to launch in Switzerland. And the goal is to be mobile, flexible. We have a hub, a small office in Zurich, but we really can work from anywhere all over the world. And we offer those services to our clients. You know, we can go to their offices, work remotely, obviously, is a big thing right now. But we do have clients that ask us to come once a week or once a month to their office to work with the team. And we also offer attractive packages in order to integrate more seamlessly into the client's workforce without being an employee. So that's really a win-win for us and the client.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have been quite lucky with the concept, because you launched it, the firm was just launched right before the pandemic, where this was probably a bit more exotic than it is now, because right now we're all, quite remote and flexible. So I think that was probably working in your favor as well.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
You already mentioned that you are also working in the field of immigration law, and I think that's quite interesting because you also immigrated here from the US. And every now and then, as you know, like we work together with American clients, a lot of them are still residing in the US. Most of them are also planning to stay there, but every now and then we get questions from people who are just interested, because we hear a lot of stories about Switzerland and they're fascinated by the country, and they're just wondering if there are any possibilities for them to migrate here, and if so, how they can go about it, and how complicated it all actually is. And I think it's fascinating that you not only have the law information to provide on that, but also the personal experience and how this process all went down.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you have clients who are interested in coming here. First of all, I have to say that I and many of my immigrant friends really love this country, and we would encourage any such desires to come over here. The things that speak in favor of Americans emigrating to Switzerland are that, let's say, the Swiss authorities informally look quite positively upon applications from Americans looking to move here. That's absolutely, there's no legal basis for that. That's obviously not in any law, but it is considered let's say, a favorable country to accept immigration from. And that's obviously because there's a huge pool of specialists in the US, highly qualified workforce members who are needed on the Swiss labor market, because the Swiss labor market, because it's so small, and because the number of children that people are having continues to decline, just cannot provide the number of employees, workers that it needs in order to keep up all of the services that Switzerland provides, all the manufacturing, but especially service professions such as financial services and the like. Also, medicine is a big topic. So if your clients are highly specialized experts in their field, in something which is really in demand in Switzerland, it's going to be possible for them to come over here. It's actually going to be quite likely that they'll receive a work permit if the conditions are fulfilled. So if I go back a step and kind of describe the process, we can differentiate between two groups of clients, which we actually also help. There's the highly qualified employees, the specialists, and then there are high net worth individuals. For example, Tina Turner is the famous example that people might know, who choose to emigrate to Switzerland not to be employed by a Swiss-based company, but just to enjoy life and to have their assets here in their center of life. So on the corporate side, Switzerland, unfortunately for your American clients, has a dual system, we might call it. EU citizens and citizens of the European Economic Area are treated preferentially compared to so-called third country citizens, not third world citizens, but citizens of countries from outside the EU. And that means that EU citizens have the right to come here. So a French national, a German, etc. Before UK, now not anymore. They're also now in the same box as Americans. So those citizens can come here, and as long as they have an employment contract with a Swiss employer, they're guaranteed a permit unless some really, really exceptional, strange circumstances arise. They can also come and open their own business, so they can incorporate a company and start doing whatever, asset management or consulting, anything they want, etc. The situation is quite different for Americans and other third country nationals, Russians, Chinese, Brazilians, everybody else in the world. Here, the Swiss labor market only accepts the highly qualified specialists and the managers. So the employer, the Swiss employer, has to submit an application and basically show why this American client of yours is required for the Swiss economy, that the employer was not able to find an EU citizen who could fill that role. And there are special ways that the employer should show that, which we help our clients with to demonstrate that. They really have to look. You can't fake that. So that's quite a hurdle to overcome, but it's doable. And certain other requirements that have to be fulfilled. So really this corporate immigration path is only open to highly qualified specialists. Again, as I said before, in certain sectors, Switzerland just doesn't have people to fill those jobs. So medicine, finance, Swiss banks constantly hiring people from outside the EU to serve its clients or in management roles, IT, AI, robotics, telecommunications, all of that. There's just not enough people here. So those employees have a good chance of receiving a work permit. Engineering, so really specialized things that normally would work.
But so that means, if I can just quickly ask, first of all, you need to have an employment contract or like a job offer on the table. And then, but even if you have that, there's no guarantee that like the permit is actually going to be granted. The employer will have to be very clear and persistent on why they need to hire this person from like outside of the EU.
That's correct. Yeah. And as you said, they have to show why they have to show that they couldn't find anyone from the EU to fill that role. And if I may give a tip to your audience, it's very important that the American employee not be made the offer before the EU citizens are looked for. If you do it the wrong way around, that's going to mean that it was a fake search and the application will be rejected. So you really have to go through that process. But again, it's doable. And if you have a great candidate from the US, I would encourage your clients to try to apply for the work permit because it's really looked upon quite favorably by the authorities here.
And so how about the high net worth route that Tina Turner took, for example?
Tina Turner took advantage of the lump sum taxation system in Switzerland. That's a way for EU citizens as well can take advantage of it, but mostly it's used by, again, the American and Russian and Brazilian nationals who want to come to Switzerland. There's about 4,500 people on that who have received work permits and are living in Switzerland right now based on it. And it's basically, how should I put this? It's Switzerland's fiscal interest in having those people here. So Tina Turner, I have no idea what her income and her assets are. I suppose they're quite significant. And Switzerland is interested in taxing her. So someone like her, but it doesn't have to be that much. It also works with less, can submit an application to be taxed according to this special system. I won't get into the details because it's a bit boring, but if you have, let's say, if you have enough, you can come here on the basis of how much you're going to contribute financially to the Swiss tax system. It's really as simple as that. You also have to have,
do you have like an approximate minimum number of like what would be considered enough for that to make, like for this route to make sense, for an application to make sense?
That's a really good question, and people ask that a lot. There are minimums in the cantonal laws and in the federal laws. Like in the US and Switzerland, there's taxation on a federal level and then on local levels. So each canton, as we call the regions of Switzerland, they have their own minimum thresholds. So it's going to be between, normally on average, about 500,000 Swiss francs per year, which would be the tax base for the income tax. And as for the assets, it's calculated as a multiplier of that. Again, as a tip to the audience, it's the case that for non-EU nationals, those thresholds are informally supposed to be higher for non-EU citizens. So this 500,000 base, for example, in the canton of Zug, it would have to be higher than that for an American as a rule in order to get the permit. But that's not set in stone either. It's a little bit of a, it's an application process and the negotiation almost with the tax authorities.
You just also brought something up that's quite interesting in a different sense with the cantons that we have here that are very similar to the states in the US. So maybe we can also talk a little bit about how maybe culturally, but also from the systems, Switzerland and the US are similar, how they have a lot of things in common, and maybe also some of the ways that they differ. I think also from a law perspective, that's probably interesting, but again, also from your personal experience having lived in both countries.
There are, that's, it's a good point. I've never really thought about how similar the cantons are to the states. I think there are certainly similarities in that each canton does have, to a certain extent, its own laws. Just like in the US, the laws are actually can be very different from state to state, even criminal sanctions. And then there's also this level of federal law which applies. In Switzerland, it's bit more, actually it's much more uniformized. There's a lot more federal law than in the US. In the US, there's a lot more state law. And that makes it easier, I would say, for residents of Switzerland to, also when moving between cantons, between our states, to figure out what's going to apply, because things are not going to be hugely different. One really relevant example for me is the admission to the bar. In the US, every state has its own admission to the bar. So if you move from New York to California, you have to go through the process of getting admitted to the bar there. In Switzerland, if you're admitted to the bar in Zurich, you're admitted to practice in any canton, and you can change your place of residence and be a practicing lawyer anywhere. It's even possible, theoretically, to be a lawyer in Zurich and go to court hearings in Geneva in French and defend your client's interests there, although clearly it's not often done because people usually don't speak the language well enough. But there are people who do it. And otherwise, huge differences. One similarity to the US state system is taxation. So huge differences in the amount of income tax which is charged. For example, New York, enormous income taxes depending on where you live, and Florida, 0, right? And in Switzerland, the differences can be quite as big, except there's no Swiss canton which charges 0% income tax. That doesn't exist in Switzerland, unfortunately.
Okay, interesting. And if someone is able to jump through all the hoops that are needed to move to Switzerland, how are ways to integrate into the country, get acquainted with like Swiss friends, and just find your place over here? What do you have some recommendations or tips or things that might be helpful for someone who has never lived in Europe or Switzerland more specifically?
Yeah, definitely. People, ask that all the time, and it's a huge topic of conversation among expats, especially when I came here. It was a huge thing. A bit easier for me because I went to college with Swiss students. I was the only foreigner in my class of 200, so obviously all my friends were Swiss from the very beginning. And for someone who, for an expat who arrives, let's say working at Google as a manager, working in English all day with an international team and a lot of maybe other Americans, that's going to be more of a challenge. Clearly, getting in touch with any Swiss at your workplace is probably the easiest way for most people. Some might say that's not so easy because the Swiss are famous or infamous for being reserved, modest, and a little bit cold. I don't necessarily agree with that in all respects, but that's the general stereotype. There is some, let's say, some truth to it. On the other hand, there's the stereotype that Swiss people are extremely loyal, hospitable, willing to go out of their way for you as long as you kind of get into their circle. So that's the other side of the coin with the reservedness. At the workplace, in any clubs that you can join, there's a huge amount of various hobby, groups and clubs. German class. I've had people go on outings actually with the German class, and there's also classes where you can exchange, with Swiss, kind of a language exchange, German English or French English if you're living in a French speaking part. And really, I think that last point, learning the language, is the key to integration in Switzerland. It's really, I've observed that all my friends who haven't learned the language don't manage to integrate with Swiss people really barely or not at all. And those that do it, they're more accepted. And obviously they have more opportunities to interact with Swiss because in general, the level of English in Switzerland is very high, but not with all people. And not everyone wants to speak English with you all the time. So if you can meet, Swiss friends on their own language level, that's really appreciated and really can help your integration.
One thing that I'm just personally curious about, how was your approach to Swiss German? I know you personally, so I know you understand Swiss German, and your German is also excellent. But I've always wondered that if you're coming from a place far away, it seems to be quite a challenge, because even if you do speak and understand high or regular German, I think it can still pose a little bit of a challenge, which is what I see with some German friends that I have, where German is their mother language, but they still struggle to understand me if I speak the way I learned to speak growing up.
Yeah, I have a very unpopular approach to this question. And I tell this to all my friends, American, German, any country, also French-speaking Swiss people who learn German but don't understand Swiss German always. And my approach is basically stop whining and learn. I mean, it's okay. Really, it's really linguistically possible to learn what they call high German, which is a horrible term from a Swiss perspective, but to learn German, which is spoken in Germany. And then on that basis, to begin to understand Swiss German, it's just linguistically a fact that it's possible. So the Americans will go to German class, which you must do, really, just do it from the very beginning. It'll make your life easier. If you're the German speaking part, you learn, a good basic level of German, and then you have your Swiss friends speak only Swiss German to you. And I promise you, within a few weeks or at the most a few months, you're going to understand 75% of what's said, or 99% of what's said. And just don't be afraid. Stop whining and just try it.
Okay, tough love approach to language barriers, I think. So maybe we can end with a more personal question on what were some of the things that positively or negatively surprised you about Switzerland as a country or as a society here? Some of the things you didn't expect.
A lot of things. In general, Swiss culture and US culture, they're not that different. We're not talking about two countries with a completely different approach to life and law and all of that. There's tons of similarities. So don't get your clients shouldn't get scared away by these portrayals of Switzerland as a reserved and a different country. There's way more similarities than differences. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, to keep an open mind. But there are differences, some positive from an American perspective, some negative. I always tell the same story. Remember as a US resident going to the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, in order to get a driver's license or update your license or change your license plates. And remember waiting 1, 2, 3 hours in line at the DMV before your ticket came up and you could do it. In a Swiss DMV, you walk up, there's probably maximum one person in front of you in line. There are plenty of people waiting to serve you, very polite, easy, in and out within 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, and this for me is just an anecdote which shows the great organization in Switzerland. And it's really true. There are always exceptions, but normally there are no big administrative bureaucratic issues here. Things just work. You get your health insurance, you pay your taxes, you submit simple forms to do this or that. You can talk directly to the authorities. Like if you have a question about your taxes, you're doing them yourself, you can actually call the tax authorities and ask them a question about something that you want to know. And they will talk to you personally for as long as you need and answer your questions. So yeah, this is the great organization. I guess because it's a much smaller country, it's easier to manage, and there are resources. There are budgets, and no huge budget deficits normally to provide those services. That's a huge plus. And that also reflects on personal relations. Things here are slower, let's say, from a US perspective. The pace of life is slower, in a good and in a bad way. You could look at it both ways. The work-life balance is really, really different than in the US. And at the same time, some Americans find here that it's a little bit maybe too relaxed for them, but it depends on what company you're working at or what else you do with your life. You might hate it or love it. I think those are some important differences between US and Switzerland.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. So before we let you go, maybe share with our audience where they can find you if they have any more questions about any of the topics that you just covered. If they're interested in migration or any of the other areas that you mentioned during our conversation, where can they go? Where can I find out more about you and your company?
I think the easiest place to find us is online and by email, because we're traveling around so much on client matters, and also just with this mobile working concept that you never know whether you'll find us at our hub in Zurich or on a business trip in Paris or in New York or working remotely from some desert island or something like that. So probably the easiest is to go to our website, which is www.flyingllawyers.ch, spelled exactly how it sounds, and then getting our contact information from there. And I'm obviously more than happy to answer any questions formally or informally about the things we talked about in the podcast today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll definitely also put that into the show notes. So if you didn't catch that, you should find the link there as well. Thank you again so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you, and I'm looking forward to the next time we can catch up in person.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. I'm really looking forward to it. Take care.
Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the WHVP podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it and found it informative. If you would like to check more about Alisa Burkhard and Flyingllawyers, check them out at their website at flyingllawyers.ch. If you want to learn more about WHVP and what we do, check us out at whvp.ch, or find us at any of our social media handles on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube by simply searching WHVP. Have a good rest of your week.